Welcome back. As I promised, we're going to talk about the difference between a spongy bone and a compact bone, and that's going to be our Handout 6C. So Handout 6C is going to compare these two types of bone that I just mentioned in our last video. Now, if we look at spongy bone is made out of a structure called trabeculae. So trabeculae is this network of bone matrix that produces kind of a spongy appearance. That's why we call this spongy bone. There's a lot of spaces in the trabeculae bone or trabecular bone that contain bone marrow. So this spongy bone is not empty, it's not full of holes, it's actually filled with bone marrow. And what you need to realize is the trabecular bone structure, this histology, is the same as what we just talked about in the previous videos. We've got bone matrix, which is this tan area, surrounding cells that live in lacunae lakes. So these osteocyte cells are going to live in the lacunae lakes, and then they're connected by caniculi, and they are surrounded by a matrix. So I know this is a little small on your diagram, but this is perfect. You can see all the tan areas are the matrix. So remember, the matrix is made out of an inorganic mineral like calcium carbonate and an organic protein called collagen. And that's the matrix. Then the cells are spaced out within this trabeculae, and they live in lacunae lakes with the caniculi, just like what we learned before. Now, they form these structures called trabeculae, which is the spongy bone. Now, trabeculae, or spongy bone, are found at the ends of long bones, so at the epiphyses of long bones, but they also make up the middle of flat, short, and irregular bones. So if you look at this diagram that I have over here on the right-hand side, you can see this is obviously the head of a femur. And the head of the femur, because it's an epiphysis, is going to be made out of this spongy bone containing trabeculae. Now what's really cool is the trabeculae, the lines of the trabecular bone, are going to orient along lines of stress to make this bone as strong as it possibly can be. So when you look at this, these blue lines are going to show lines of stress, and you can follow those trabecular bone patterns along the lines of stress. Now, if we change the way we walk or our posture, the bone will realign itself to new lines of stress. So this is how we can kind of tell if a person had an injury, or if they had some deformity that caused them to walk differently. We can analyze their skeleton, look at this trabecular bone, and we can make judgments on how a person walked or what kind of posture they might have had. So if you're always wondering, like, how would they know these things about, let's say, Egyptian mummies? All they got to do is analyze their skeletal system, and they can learn a lot about that individual. So this is just one way, looking at this trabecular bone or spongy bone, to try and find abnormalities or injuries or disease and that kind of thing. All right, so that's just something that's interesting. Spongy bone is also called trabecular bone. So if I say trabecular bone or if I say spongy bone, I'm really talking about the same thing, okay? So don't let that confuse you. It says that spongy bone forms most of the structure of flat, short, and irregular bones and the epiphyses of long bones, all right? Another side note here is the bone marrow that's inside these spaces is red bone marrow, and this is where we're going to make red blood cells. Okay, now the other type of bone is called compact bone. Compact bone is very different. It's still made of the matrix of a mineral and collagen, and it still has those same three cells, the osteoblasts, the osteocytes, and the osteoclasts. However, they're built in a different pattern. So instead of having these patterns of trabeculae where we build bone that has all these spaces that fill it up, we build the bone matrix into something called an osteon with the compact bone. So it says compact bones contain osteons. They're sometimes called Haversian systems. Osteons are rings of bone matrix. So if you look at this picture, it's kind of hard to see, but this is actually a ring structure. So these rings, you can kind of see it better in this. See, all of the tan area is the matrix, and all the dark spots are the cells. So the osteocytes live in the little lacunae lakes in these dark areas, and that's surrounded by tan area of matrix. Now, these osteons are made of rings. So we have rings of matrix called lamellae, or lamellar rings. And so every osteon is made up of layers called lamellae. Inside the center of this ring is a structure called the Haversian canal. Haversian canals contain blood vessels that feed the bone. So you can see there are Haversian canals that have blood vessels in this diagram. They are surrounded by lamellar sheets. There are also canals that connect one Haversian canal to another. So here we've got one blood vessel here in a Haversian canal, and then a second one, and we have this joining canal called the Volkmann's canal, and they link the Haversian canals so that blood can flow from one Haversian canal into another one. But this structure makes up a very dense bone called compact bone. So we don't find compact bone in the epiphyses. We find them in all of the diaphyses of long bones, and they make up the outer portion of short, flat, and irregular bones. So the compact bone is named compact because it's very dense. There's not those spaces like in spongy bone. It doesn't look like a sponge. It looks like a solid structure. Now, compact bone covers the outside of all bones. So when you're actually holding a bone in lab class, what you're touching is compact bone. If you remember in that other handout, I showed you the periosteum, the outer layer of a bone, and that's made of compact bone. So compact bone and spongy bone are the two types of bone that build all of our skeletal system. And so I hope that gives you an idea of the difference. All right. So next we're going to move on to handout 6D, and hopefully that'll conclude what we have to do online. And then the rest of the chapter will be in person for next week. So keep that in mind as you prepare. All right.